Hi, my name's Catherine from Crime Psych, and in this video we're going to look at offender profiling. So we're going to talk about what offender profiling is. And if you ask me today what offender profiling is, I'll give you a very different answer to the one I might have given you 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I might have said to you, oh, offender profiling is somebody, a profiler or a detective turning up to a crime scene, assessing the behaviours and the interactions between the offender and the victim, looking at the interactions, looking at the behaviours, examining the crime scene, and then being able to tell things about the offender, being able to tell things like the mindset of the offender or the personality of the offender, or maybe even their motivation for committing the crime. And it's very unsurprising that before I started studying this subject, that I held that view. I'm sure many of you hold that view of that's what offender profiling is, because that's the way the media portray it. Films such as Silence of the Lambs gave us a neat little idea that a profiler or an FBI agent could turn up at a crime scene or interview an offender and be able to get into the mind of the offender or to psychologically assess them based on the actions or the behaviours alone, to enable the police to then hunt down the killer or the rapist or whichever serial offender the police were looking for. Even English TV programmes such as Cracker portray the idea that one educated individual can turn up to a crime scene, look at the information, and then be able to tell lots of different things about the offender who's carried those actions and behaviours out. Whereas the reality is somewhat different. I was a little bit disappointed to find out that individual profilers don't actually do that. There's a lot more science that goes into profiling different types of crimes, and that's what we're going to discuss today. First of all, you've got the FBI. The FBI set up their behavioural science unit in Quantico, and they were a group of law enforcement officers who used their own experience to create a system of profiling offenders. Ressler and Douglas in particular pioneered these ideas that you could look at behaviours and actions which had been carried out at a crime scene and then be able to tell things about the person who'd carried out those types of crimes. I have done a whole video looking at the FBI profiling methods, and in the video I'll put a link in the description if you want to go click it to watch it after this one. But in that video I take a look at how heavily criticised those initial attempts at offender profiling have been. What they did was they used their own experience and in-depth interviews with violent serial offenders to examine things like their motivation, what their likely age were, what their likely behaviours are going to be for each of the different crimes that they interviewed the offenders for. And they came up with a classification system of saying, okay, well, violent serial offenders either behaved in a disorganised or an organised way. And so organised offenders would be quite neat and tidy. They'd plan the offence beforehand and they would have one set of attributes which could be linked to a particular offender, whereas disorganised offenders are more likely to be impulsive, more likely to be unemployed, less likely to have been a planned event, and also have a set of characteristics which would go along with those types of behaviours. But as I did mention in that video, that profiling method has been fairly heavily criticised because it wasn't scientifically tested. It wasn't rigorously tested enough. They only actually interviewed 36 individuals. Okay, they did base their knowledge and their findings on their in-depth knowledge, what they already knew about offenders. But this meant that other researchers had difficulty testing the model. So ideally what you want to do is take the model of the organised and disorganised behaviours of offenders and then go test that on different subsets of individuals in different places to see if the same behaviours match onto the same characteristics. And when academic researchers began to do that with the FBI organised disorganised model, they found that it wasn't very reliable. They found that at some crime scenes behaviours couldn't be classed as exclusively organised or exclusively disorganised, and so then the FBI came up with a mixed classification which included organised and disorganised. But however, that was a very important starting point for offender profiling, because then that allowed other researchers to have the basis of what we need to look at and how rigorously we need to test scientific models which match actions to characteristics of various offenders. Just before I go on to talk about a little bit about what offender profiling actually is these days, I just want you to have a quick think about something that you do normally, naturally, on a day-to-day basis that you do every single day. It might be getting up, getting dressed, going for a bath, going for a shower, going to the spa, putting your makeup on, whatever it is. So let's say, for example, I was putting makeup on. I would always get the moisturiser first, then I'd always put the foundation on, then I'd put the eyeshadow on, always use the same colours, and the mascara and eyeliner, lipstick, blah, 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 so on. And I would normally do that the exact same way each time. However, if I'd had a pimple on a particular day when I woke up, I might spend extra time trying to cover that up, whereas I wouldn't normally do that on other days. If I hadn't slept well and I had dark circles under my eyes, I might spend extra time using concealer or skin brighteners to brighten up that area. And so when we're looking at the behavioural patterns of offenders, we're looking at for similar types of patterns. There are things that offenders do consistently at each crime scene that they go to, and there are other behaviours which are quite specific to the various crime scenes. And so we need to be very careful to identify what behaviours we're going to examine to be able to link those to specific characteristics or attributes of the offenders. Now, the reason why I've mentioned doing my makeup is because of that habitual nature of what we do every day. The premise of offender profiling is that we can look at a subset of behaviours and then link that to some characteristics or some personality attributes, or an age or a gender or an ethnicity, things like that. So we need to know what level of specificity that we're examining the behaviours on, and we need to know what attributes are going to be of use when we're creating these profiles. And so that's the starting point of creating a profile of offenders. Which behaviours are going to tell us about which attributes, and how is that going to be helpful for any future investigation. If we were to look at a burglary, for instance, if there were fingerprints found at a burglary crime scene, we could assume that the offender wasn't very experienced and didn't have their fingerprints on hold at a particular police force, and so weren't very careful to leave it, whereas a more experienced burglar might take time to wipe their fingerprints away. If a particular offender has in-depth knowledge of burglar alarms work, they might disable those things before they enter the property, which shows that the offender has committed that type of offence before and knows what they need to do to evade capture. But then again, when we look at those types of behaviours, we need to actually consider, are they specific to that one context, or that minimum set or that set of 10 burglaries that individual has done? Can they be applied across all burglaries? Because, as I said, each individual offender will have a characteristic way of behaving, but things might happen at a crime scene which surprise an offender, which might change the way that they behave. A particular offender might always avoid coming into contact with people when they commit their offence. However, if they weren't expecting people to be at a property and they burgled it and found that they were there, there's going to be some sort of confrontation that there wouldn't normally be. So we need to look at the behaviours which are going to be most consistent from one crime scene to another for each offender. We don't want to look at behaviours which are too specific or too general. If we were again to look at the burglary case and we get to a burglary or a set of burglaries which have been committed on a street where money and cash have been stolen, well, that's not very unusual, because if there was money or cash available in the property, it would usually be taken when somebody burgles the house. Similarly, if large items were left behind at a property, you could assume that the offender is more likely to be on foot than in a vehicle. However, what if things change? What if the large electrical items that weren't taken were a big fat-bagged old 1980s television that was just too heavy for the offender to carry, or not very valuable? And in a similar way, you can make the assumption that, say, if antiques were stolen at a particular burglary, that these were targeted attacks, that this offender is specialised in stealing particular types of antiques. However, what if a burglar has gone to a set of properties, looked at the ornaments and gone, oh, my mum would like that, I'll take that. Oh, my nan would like that. And then takes antique goods, whereas they wouldn't normally have taken them unless they come across them. And so we need to find the balance of being specific enough to be unique to each attribute of the offender without being too general so that we can't tell offenders apart. And so when we profile any crime, we want to be gathering the information which, as I said, is consistently committed at each various crime scene. If we're to consider that humans can change their behaviour depending on the context, it would be wrong of us to say that if an offender came across somebody who's in the property that they're burglaring, that they're violent towards them. That doesn't necessarily mean that that individual will have a violent nature and will always act violently or aggressively. They may just be shocked. They may just be having a particularly aggressive day, whereas they wouldn't normally do that. If a burglar alarm has been disabled, we can't, with 100% accuracy, say, oh, well, that offender's likely to have experience of alarm systems because they've known how to disable that alarm system. They may know the property that they're going to burgle, have Googled how to disable a particular alarm set which is on that house and done that when they turned up to do that burglary, but that's not necessary to say that they would have done that at other burglaries which they've done before. So it's unique to each individual crime. So we need to get the right level of behaviour to match the right characteristic. What we more accurately want to do is we want to take larger data sets of individuals. If we were to take the small set of burglars, and all of those burglars were between the age of 12 and 75 with an average age of 35, we couldn't honestly say that most burglars are going to be within the ages of 12 and 75 with an average age of 35. Because it's such a small data set, what we want is much larger data sets of 1,000 and upwards. And we want to test the models, we want to test the data, we want to take the information, put it into statistical package softwares and test it. And then the assumptions that we come out with, say we come out with the assumption that the average burglar is a white male who's aged 21 years of age and knows the area that they're burgling. That doesn't mean with 100% accuracy that if we were to have an 18-year-old male from the area stood in front of us, that they've committed that crime. It just means that they're most likely to have committed the crime. And in a similar way, we could say that, well, a 75-year-old couldn't commit that crime because it's usually a 21-year-old from within the area. And so whenever we're creating profiles, we can never be 100% accurate or confident with the information that we're using, but we can be 90 to 95% confident with the links that we're making between these actions and the characteristics to create profiles of offenders. By matching which characteristics match which behaviours, we can then build up a model of a particular type of offence, and the one that I'm talking about at the moment is burglary. So once we have all that information and our assumptions about the burglary, we then want to take that model and test it on different subsets of individuals in different areas to see if the same rules of behaviour and characteristics can be matched up. And in that way we can create profiles with very good accuracy which are statistically tested over time. I have written a number of blogs on the difficulties that we face in creating profiles, where if you go to the website at crimepsych.co.uk, there's a blog which I've written on linking crimes together, which gives more of an in-depth talk about which behaviours we should be looking at and which characteristics are going to be of most use. It would be pointless of us to say, well, this murderer is going to be a psychopath, because the police wouldn't know whether somebody is going to be a psychopath by simply having a list of suspects. They would need to interview each suspect and find out whether they're a psychopath or not. And so we need to be given information which is useful in reducing large lists of suspects down to more manageable sizes. We want to be looking beyond the label of the crime as well. Let's take murder as an example. Taking somebody's life isn't always a crime. It's not always murder. If somebody was to have a fight outside of a bar on a Friday night and punch somebody so hard that they died, then yes, that's murder. However, if a soldier goes to war and kills one of the enemy, then he's doing his job and that is celebrated. And in a similar way, if a nurse was to give a lethal dose of poison or a lethal dose of medicine to a patient, then yes, she's committed murder. However, if an official on death row administers a lethal injection, then they're simply doing their job. So we need to look beyond the labels of the crimes, and we want to look at the behaviours which have been carried out, the way that the offender and the victim are interacting. We want to be looking, what was the purpose of the offence? Was a particular offence committed because the offender wanted to get something, some material thing, as a result of that offence, or was the offence committed because that individual enjoys violence or is angry in a day-to-day basis? And so by examining the behaviours in the crime and taking away that crime label, we can more reliably link those to specific characteristics of different individuals. And so when investigative psychologists create profiles, that's what we're doing. We're not looking at the label of the crime, we're looking at the behaviours which have been carried out. In conclusion then, it's not a simple process to create a profile of a specific crime like murder or burglary or arson. Even arson, you might think, well, that's just one classification of offence. However, what if the arson was committed, what if the fire was lit to get rid of evidence at a crime scene? What if the fire was lit because the offender wanted to see the fire and got some sort of enjoyment from seeing something burnt down and destroyed? And they're both very psychologically different, and each of those types of offenders will have very different characteristics and a very different nature. So people will behave in a habitual way in their day-to-day lives, but it is worth remembering that different contexts can change behaviours, and so we need to look for the behaviours which are going to be consistent from one crime scene to another for each particular offender. I do hope that you've gained some knowledge from this video rather than just confusing you and going, oh, you can't do profiling. You can, so long as you're looking at the correct behaviours, you're not looking at the crime labels solely by themselves, and you're looking at the characteristics which are going to be of use in identifying suspects. If you've enjoyed the video, hit the like button. You can go over to the website and check out the other blogs and vlogs which I've done, and I thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.